The crowd of 200 mourners froze mid-prayer as the massive lioness emerged from the Montana wilderness, her amber eyes scanning the sea of black suits and tearful faces surrounding the flag-draped casket. Liberty's powerful stride never faltered as she approached the military honor guard, who instinctively reached for weapons that weren't there. This wasn't supposed to happen. Wild animals don't attend funerals. A woman screamed and stumbled backward into the floral arrangements, sending white lilies cascading across the dusty ground. Children clung to their parents' legs as grown men stepped behind headstones, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. But 72-year-old Sarah Mitchell, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, remained perfectly still as Liberty padded past her toward the simple wooden casket where Frank Sullivan lay in his dress blues. The same Frank who had saved this lioness 11 years ago. The same Frank who had just died protecting her newborn cubs. "Nobody move," the funeral director whispered through clenched teeth, his clipboard trembling in his white-knuckled grip. How had Liberty escaped her enclosure? And why was she here at this moment when Frank could no longer protect anyone from her? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Frank Sullivan had awakened at 0600 hours sharp, just as he had every morning for the past 20 years. The routine never changed, not since the day they'd handed him that folded flag and told him his boy Michael wasn't coming home from Iraq. At 72, Frank's weathered hands still moved with military precision as he pulled on his worn Carhartt jacket and stepped into the crisp Montana dawn. The Circle of Life Wildlife Sanctuary stretched across 47 acres of big sky country, home to 6 African lions that most folks thought he was crazy for keeping. But Frank Sullivan had learned long ago that sometimes the crazy thing was the right thing, especially when it came to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Morning, Liberty," he called softly as he approached the largest enclosure, where a magnificent lioness lay beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. At 11 years old, Liberty was no longer young by lion standards, but her amber eyes still held the intelligence that had first captivated Frank when he'd rescued her from that traveling circus outside Billings. The circus owner had been beating her with a cattle prod, trying to force her through flaming hoops for a crowd of drunken spectators. Frank had bought her freedom with his last $1,000. Liberty rose gracefully and padded toward the fence, a low rumble of greeting vibrating in her chest. This was their ritual. Frank would speak, Liberty would listen, and for a few precious moments the old veteran could pretend he wasn't the loneliest man in Montana. "Sarah's coming by today," Frank continued, measuring out Liberty's breakfast. Sarah Mitchell was a veterinary student from the university who volunteered her weekends to help with the lions. At 28, she reminded Frank of the daughter he'd never had, all compassion and fire with enough stubbornness to match his own. "Might want to behave yourself this time. Last week you nearly gave that girl a heart attack when you knocked over the water trough." Liberty's tail twitched, what Frank had learned to recognize as her version of laughter. What Frank didn't tell Liberty, what he couldn't bring himself to say out loud, even to his most trusted companion, was that yesterday's mail had brought news that would change everything. The bank notice was still folded in his shirt pocket, the words burned into his memory. Final notice. $50,000 past due. 30 days to remit payment or face foreclosure proceedings. $50,000 might as well have been $50 million. Frank's military pension barely covered the Lions' food and medical expenses, and his savings account held exactly $47.33. He'd been hiding his own heart medication costs for months, rationing pills and ignoring the crushing chest pains that came more frequently now. But Liberty didn't need to know that her world might disappear in 30 days. Neither did the other 5 lions who depended on him or Sarah, who looked at him like he was some kind of hero instead of just a stubborn old man who'd bitten off more than he could chew. Some burdens, Frank had learned, were meant to be carried alone. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Frank found himself doubled over beside Liberty's enclosure, clutching his chest as waves of pain radiated down his left arm. The attack lasted only 30 seconds, but it left him gasping and shaky, his military-trained composure cracking for the first time in years. Liberty pressed against the fence, her massive head tilted in concern, and Frank forced himself to straighten up. "I'm okay, girl," he wheezed, though they both knew he was lying. The nitroglycerin tablets hidden in his coffee tin were nearly gone, and he couldn't afford a doctor's visit, let alone a cardiologist. That afternoon, when Sarah arrived for her weekly volunteer shift, she found Frank sitting on an overturned feed bucket, staring at a crumpled envelope in his hands. "Bad news?" she asked, setting down her veterinary bag. Frank looked up, and Sarah was startled by how much older he seemed since last week. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his usually steady hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter. "Bank wants their money," he said simply. 30 days, or they take the sanctuary." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "How much?" 50,000. Frank's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah caught the slight crack in his composure. "Been behind for a while now. Kept thinking something would work out." "Frank, there are programs, grants for wildlife conservation, fundraising campaigns. We could start a GoFundMe page, reach out to animal rights organizations. No charity." Frank stood abruptly, his pride flaring like an old wound. "I've been taking care of myself and mine since before you were born, young lady. Don't intend to start begging now." Sarah bit back her response, recognizing the stubborn set of his jaw that she'd seen whenever anyone suggested he was getting too old for this work. Instead, she watched him hobble toward Liberty's enclosure, favoring his left leg more than usual. It was then that she noticed something that made her heart sink. Frank's lunch consisted of a can of bargain-brand dog food and a sleeve of saltine crackers. "Frank," she said carefully, "what are you eating?" He glanced back at the open can with embarrassment. "It's not so bad with hot sauce. Protein's protein. You're eating dog food so the lions can have meat." "They didn't choose to be here," Frank said, his voice growing defensive. "I did. That makes them my responsibility." That evening, after Frank had completed his rounds and retreated to his small trailer on the property, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about the stubborn old veteran. While searching for veterinary records in Frank's filing cabinet, she found a folder marked Sanctuary Expenses that contained 20 years' worth of bank statements. Every month, without fail, Frank's military pension check was deposited and immediately spent on lion food, medical supplies, and facility maintenance. There were no personal expenses beyond the bare minimum, no cable television, no restaurant meals, no new clothes. For 2 decades, Frank Sullivan had been living like a monk, so 6 lions could live like royalty. But buried beneath the bank statements was something even more remarkable. A stack of letters from something called the MS Foundation, each containing a check for $500 and a simple note. "For the lions, with gratitude." 20 years of monthly donations totaling over $120,000, money that could have saved the sanctuary 10 times over. The checks had never been cashed. Sarah confronted Frank the next morning, waving the uncashed checks like evidence in a courtroom. "What is this? Who is MS?" "Foundation, and why haven't you deposited these?" Frank's face went pale, then red, then resigned. He sank into his chair like a man who'd been carrying a secret too heavy for his shoulders. "Michael Sullivan Foundation," he said quietly. "My boy's unit in Iraq. Been sending money since he died. Took me years to figure out what MS stood for." "Frank, this is over $100,000. You could have saved the sanctuary, bought better equipment, hired help." It's guilt money, Frank interrupted, his voice sharp with old pain. They think they owe me something because Michael didn't make it home. But I didn't send my boy to war so his friends could take care of his old man. Michael died doing his duty. That's not a debt. Sarah stared at him, finally understanding the depth of Frank's pride and pain. So you've been slowly starving yourself instead of accepting help from people who care about you. I've been taking care of my own, Frank corrected. Same as always. Even if it kills you? Frank looked out at Liberty, who was watching their conversation through the fence with those intelligent amber eyes. Some things are worth dying for, Sarah. Michael knew that. These lions know that. Question is whether you're brave enough to live for something bigger than yourself. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Sarah's decision came in the form of a phone call she made at 3 in the morning, sitting in her truck outside the sanctuary gates. She'd been researching for hours, following paper trails and making connections that Frank had either missed or deliberately ignored. The number she dialed belonged to Richard Blackwood III, one of Montana's most powerful real estate developers. Mr. Blackwood, this is Sarah Mitchell. I work at the Circle of Life Wildlife Sanctuary. I think we need to talk about Frank Sullivan. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the connection had dropped. When Blackwood finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. What about Frank Sullivan? You're foreclosing on his property in 23 days, but I think you already knew that. Another pause. Ms. Mitchell, I think you're confused about my involvement. Your development company holds the mortgage. You've been the primary creditor for 15 years. And according to county records, you've been listed as Frank's emergency contact at the hospital since 2008. Sarah's voice grew stronger as the pieces fell into place. So, either you're running the world's most elaborate coincidence, or there's something you're not telling me about your relationship with Frank Sullivan. The line went dead. 2 hours later, Sarah was awakened by the sound of an expensive car pulling up the gravel drive. Through her trailer window, she watched a tall, silver-haired man in a $1,000 suit climb out of a black Mercedes. Even at dawn, Richard Blackwood looked like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. Frank emerged from his trailer at the sound of the car, moving stiffly in the morning cold. Sarah crept closer, positioning herself where she could hear their conversation. "Hello, Frank." "Richie." Frank's voice was flat, emotionless. "Been a while." 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "Not that I'm counting." Sarah's breath caught. These men knew each other, intimately, painfully. "You look old," Frank observed. "You look like hell." Blackwood glanced around the sanctuary, taking in the worn fencing and aging facilities. "This is what you did with your life after Michael? This is what I did with my life, period." Frank crossed his arms defensively. "Some of us don't get to run away and play real estate mogul when things get tough." "Run away?" Blackwood's voice rose, his careful control slipping. "I built an empire, Frank. I created jobs, developed communities." "You built walls," Frank interrupted. "Around your heart, around your conscience. Tell me, Richie, when was the last time you slept through the night without seeing his face?" The question hit Blackwood like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment the powerful businessman disappeared, replaced by a broken man in an expensive suit. "Every night," he whispered. "Every single night for 18 years. Sarah felt like she was watching a dam break. Whatever history these men shared, it was carved in grief and regret. "Why now?" Frank asked, his voice gentler. "Why foreclose now?" "Because I'm tired, Frank. Tired of carrying this guilt. tired of watching you slowly kill yourself out here, tired of pretending that what happened wasn't my fault." Blackwood pulled out a manila folder from his car. "Do you know what this is?" Frank shook his head. "It's every bank payment you've missed for the last 5 years. I've been covering them. Anonymous payments, routed through 3 different shell companies so you'd never know." Blackwood's voice cracked. "But I can't do it anymore. I can't keep enabling your martyrdom." "Martyrdom?" Frank's face reddened. "You think this is martyrdom? Taking care of creatures that can't take care of themselves? I think it's guilt!" Blackwood exploded. "I think you blame yourself for Michael's death just like I do, and you're punishing yourself by living like a hermit with a bunch of goddamn lions." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah pressed herself against the trailer, afraid to breathe. "You want to know about guilt?" Frank's voice was dangerously quiet. "Guilt is watching your 18-year-old son pack his duffel bag because his best friend convinced him that military service would make a man out of him. Guilt is getting that phone call 2 years later. Guilt is burying your only child while his so-called best friend was too busy building his empire to attend the funeral." "I couldn't," Blackwood started. "You couldn't what? Face the consequences of your advice? Deal with the fact that you pushed my boy into enlisting? Or maybe you just couldn't face his fiancée after she left him for dead in that hospital bed in Germany?" Sarah's gasp was audible. Both men turned toward her trailer, suddenly aware they had an audience. "Jennifer left him?" Sarah stepped out, abandoning any pretense of privacy. "Mr. Blackwood, Jennifer is your daughter?" Blackwood's face went ashen. "How do you—" "Because I read the letters," Sarah said firmly. "The ones Michael wrote to Frank from the hospital. He mentioned Jennifer by name, how she stopped visiting, stopped calling, stopped caring the minute he got wounded." Frank looked between Sarah and Blackwood, pieces of a decades-old puzzle finally clicking into place. "She's your daughter. Jesus Christ, Richie. Your daughter broke my son's heart while he was dying in a foreign country, and you've been, what, paying penance ever since?" "She was 19. Blackwood's composure finally shattered completely. 19 years old and terrified. She couldn't handle seeing him like that, broken, changed. She made a terrible mistake, and I've been trying to make up for it ever since. By foreclosing on my sanctuary? By forcing you to accept help." Blackwood pulled out another folder, thicker than the first. "This contains deed transfers, trust documents, and a conservation easement that will protect this land in perpetuity. The sanctuary won't just survive, Frank, it will thrive, but only if you stop being too proud to let people help you." Frank stared at the documents like they might bite him. "Why?" "Because Michael loved you. Because he wrote to me about this place, about how proud he was that his father was saving lions. Because in his last letter, the one that arrived 3 days after the funeral, he asked me to take care of you if anything happened to him." Blackwood's voice broke. "And because I've spent 18 years being too much of a coward to honor that request." Sarah watched the 2 old men face each other across decades of pain and misunderstanding. Frank's military bearing had crumbled, leaving him looking every one of his 72 years. "The letters from MS Foundation," Frank said slowly. "That was you too?" "Michael's unit sent the first few. I've been sending them ever since." Blackwood wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I couldn't let you cash them. You're too stubborn. But I couldn't stop sending them either. It was the only connection I had left to him." In the distance, Liberty let out a low rumble, as if sensing the emotional storm swirling around the humans who controlled her fate. Frank looked at the documents in Blackwood's hands, then at Sarah, then back at his old friend. For the first time in 20 years, Frank Sullivan's shoulders began to shake with tears he'd been holding back since the day they buried his son. The reconciliation between Frank and Blackwood should have been the beginning of a new chapter, but life rarely unfolds as neatly as we hope. 3 days after their emotional confrontation, Sarah made a discovery that would shatter the fragile peace they'd built. She was conducting routine health checks on the lions when she noticed Liberty's behavior had changed dramatically. The lioness, usually alert and responsive, lay listlessly in the shade, occasionally pawing at her swollen belly. Sarah's veterinary training kicked in immediately, and what she saw made her blood run cold. "Frank," she called urgently, "we need to talk about Liberty. Right now." Frank hurried over, moving faster than his aging body appreciated. One look at Liberty told him everything he needed to know. "She's pregnant," he said quietly. "Not just pregnant," Sarah corrected, her voice tight with worry. "I think she's having complications. Look at her breathing. It's labored. And see how she keeps shifting position. She's in distress." Frank knelt beside the fence, studying the lioness who had been his closest companion for 11 years. Liberty's amber eyes met his, and he saw something there that made his chest tighten with more than just his heart condition. He saw trust, complete and absolute. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Could be days, could be hours. But Frank, a complicated lion birth, we're talking about $15,000 to $20,000 in veterinary costs, emergency C-section, neonatal care for the cubs if they survive, round-the-clock monitoring." Sarah's voice broke. "Even with Blackwood's help, I don't know if we can handle this financially." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hand pressed against the fence where Liberty could see it. "She saved my life once," he said finally. "Night I got the call about Michael. I was standing right here with my service pistol trying to work up the courage to end it all." Liberty started roaring, not angry, not territorial, like she was calling to me, kept it up for 3 hours straight until I put the gun away. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Frank, you never told me." "Some things a man keeps to himself." Frank stood slowly, his decision made. "Call Dr. Peterson at the veterinary college. Tell him we need the best neonatal team he's got. Money's not an object." "But Frank, where will we get—" "I'm cashing the checks," Frank said firmly. "All of them. Michael's unit wanted to help save lions, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Over the next week, as they waited for Liberty's condition to stabilize enough for safe delivery, Frank began to change in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. The rigid military structure that had governed his days for decades started to soften. He began talking more, sharing stories about Michael that he'd kept locked away for 18 years. Sarah started bringing her camera to document the sanctuary's daily operations, initially for grant applications. But she found herself drawn to Frank's quiet interactions with the lions, the way he spoke to them like family members, the tenderness in his voice when he thought no one was listening. "You know," Frank told her one evening as they watched Liberty pace restlessly in her enclosure, "Michael used to say that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being present." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Took me 18 years to understand what he meant." "Tell me about him," Sarah said softly, adjusting her camera to catch the golden hour light. Frank was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Then, slowly, the stories began to pour out. Michael's first steps taken toward Frank's outstretched arms, his determination to enlist despite Frank's protests, the last phone call from Germany, when Michael's voice was slurred from pain medication, but still bright with optimism. "He talked about this place in that last call," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Said he couldn't wait to come home and help me with the lions. Had all these ideas about education programs, bringing school kids out to learn about conservation." Frank's hands trembled as he gripped the fence. "I never told him I loved him in that call. Figured I'd have time when he got home." Sarah reached out and covered his weathered hand with her own. "He knew, Frank. Sons always know. That night, alone in his trailer, Frank did something he hadn't done since Michael's funeral. He pulled out a box from under his bed, a collection of his son's letters, photos, and personal effects returned from overseas. At the bottom of the box was Michael's last letter, still in its unopened envelope. Frank had been too broken to read it when it arrived 3 days after the funeral. For 18 years it had remained sealed, too painful to open, too precious to destroy. But now, with Liberty's cubs fighting for life in her womb and Blackwood's offer of partnership changing everything, Frank finally found the courage. The letter was brief, written in Michael's careful handwriting. Dad, if you're reading this, something went wrong over here. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but mostly, I'm sorry I won't be there to help you with the sanctuary. I've been thinking about those lions a lot, about how you saved them when nobody else would, about how you gave them a second chance at life. That's who you are, Dad. A man who sees worth in things other people have given up on. Don't give up on yourself. Don't let my dying make you stop living. The world needs more people like you, people who believe in second chances. Take care of Liberty for me. I have a feeling she's going to take care of you, too. Love always, Michael, P.S. I asked Richie to look out for you. Don't be too hard on him. We all make mistakes when we're scared. Frank read the letter 3 times before the tears came. When they did, they came with the force of 18 years of suppressed grief, washing over him like a dam bursting. For the first time since the funeral, Frank Sullivan allowed himself to mourn his son properly. The next morning, Sarah found Frank sitting beside Liberty's enclosure, the letter clutched in his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, but clearer than she'd seen them in months. He knew, Frank said simply. Somehow, he knew this day would come. That afternoon, Dr. Peterson arrived with a mobile veterinary unit and a team of specialists. The examination confirmed Sarah's fears. Liberty was carrying 3 cubs, but they were positioned poorly for natural delivery. Emergency surgery would be necessary within the next 48 hours. The mother's age is a complicating factor, Dr. Peterson explained to Frank and Sarah. 11 years old for a lioness is equivalent to a woman in her 60s having triplets. Her body is already under tremendous stress. What are her chances? Frank asked. With surgery, 50-50 for the mother, 30% for the cubs. Without surgery? Dr. Peterson shook his head. We lose them all. That evening, as Blackwood arrived to check on the situation, Frank made an announcement that surprised everyone. I want the surgery filmed, he said. All of it. Sarah's been documenting life here, and if this is how Liberty's story ends, people should see it. They should see what it costs to save a life. Frank, Sarah protested, are you sure? This could be difficult to watch. Everything worth fighting for is difficult to watch, Frank replied. Michael knew that when he enlisted. You know that every time you stick your hand in a cage with a 400-pound predator, and I know that every time I choose to love something that might not survive. Blackwood stepped forward, his business instincts warring with his personal investment. Frank, if this goes badly, if the surgery fails, having it on camera could damage the sanctuary's reputation. Potential donors might be scared away. Frank fixed his old friend with a steady gaze. Richie, my boy died trying to protect people he'd never met, in a country he'd never seen before, for principles he believed in but couldn't always explain. You think I'm going to hide from a camera because it might make some rich folks uncomfortable? The rebuke hit home. Blackwood nodded slowly. You're right. We document everything. The world deserves to see what real courage looks like. As night fell over the sanctuary, Frank made his rounds one last time before the surgery scheduled for dawn. Each lion received extra attention, as if he were preparing for a long journey. When he reached Liberty's enclosure, she was standing at the fence, waiting for him. "Tomorrow's going to be tough, girl," he said softly, pressing his palm against the chain link. Liberty nuzzled his hand through the fence, her warm breath visible in the cold Montana air. "But we've made it through tough times before, haven't we?" Liberty's low rumble of response seemed to say yes. They had indeed. Frank pulled Michael's letter from his pocket and read it aloud to Liberty, his voice carrying across the quiet sanctuary. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "He was right about you taking care of me," Frank said. "Question is, can I take care of you when it matters most?" In the distance, a coyote howled, and Liberty answered with a roar that echoed across the big sky country landscape. It was a sound of defiance, of life asserting itself against the darkness. Neither Frank nor Liberty knew that this would be their last quiet conversation. Neither knew that by tomorrow evening everything would change forever. But in that moment, man and lion stood together in the Montana darkness, bound by a love that had already survived loss, poverty, and time itself. The hardest test was yet to come. The surgery was scheduled for dawn, but Liberty's condition deteriorated rapidly during the night. At 3:30 in the morning, Sarah's frantic knocking woke Frank from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. "She's in active labor," Sarah called through his trailer door. "Dr. Peterson says we can't wait. We need to move now." Frank dressed quickly, his hands shaking as he pulled on his boots. Through his window, he could see the mobile veterinary unit's lights blazing in the darkness, casting long shadows across the sanctuary. The other lions were restless, pacing in their enclosures, sensing something momentous was happening. When Frank reached Liberty's enclosure, he found her lying on her side, breathing heavily, her massive body convulsing with contractions. Dr. Peterson and his team were already setting up equipment, transforming the small medical facility adjacent to the enclosures into an emergency surgical suite. "Frank, Doctor," Peterson called out, "we need to move her now. Every minute we wait decreases her chances and the cubs." The next hour unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Liberty, sedated but still conscious, was carefully moved to the surgical table. Frank insisted on staying close enough to maintain eye contact with her, his weathered hand pressed against the glass partition that separated them. Sarah positioned herself with her camera, documenting everything as Frank had requested. The footage she captured would later be described by animal behaviorists as one of the most emotionally powerful pieces of wildlife documentation ever recorded. "Talk to her, Frank," Dr. Peterson instructed as he began the procedure. "She can still hear you. Your voice will help keep her calm." Frank began speaking in the soft, steady tone he'd used with Liberty for 11 years. He told her about the first day he'd brought her to the sanctuary, how she'd refused to eat for a week until he started reading to her from Michael's letters. He reminded her of the winter when she'd had pneumonia and he'd slept in the barn for 3 weeks, checking on her every 2 hours. 20 minutes into the surgery, complications arose. Liberty's blood pressure began dropping dangerously and her heart rate became erratic. Dr. Peterson's team worked frantically to stabilize her while continuing the delicate process of delivering the cubs. "Frank," Dr. Peterson said grimly, "we're losing her. I need you to make a choice. We can try to save the mother, or we can focus on getting the cubs out alive. I don't think we can do both." The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Frank looked at Liberty's unconscious form, then at the monitor showing 3 tiny heartbeats still fighting for life inside her womb. It was the impossible choice every parent dreads: save the mother or save the children. "What would Michael do?" Frank whispered to himself, his hand pressed against his chest where his son's letter rested. "Frank," Dr. Peterson pressed, "I need an answer." "Save them all," Frank said firmly. "Whatever it takes. She wouldn't want her babies to die because of her." "Frank, I'm telling you, the odds—" "I don't care about odds," Frank's voice cracked with desperation. "I care about promises. I promised her I'd take care of her, and I promised Michael I'd take care of what mattered. Do your job, Doctor. Save them all." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Frank felt a crushing pain in his chest, different from his usual heart episodes. This wasn't a warning. This was the main event. His heart, already weakened by years of stress and poor self-care, was failing under the emotional and physical strain of the night. Frank gripped the partition, fighting to stay conscious. He could see Liberty on the table, could hear Dr. Peterson calling for additional equipment, could feel his own strength ebbing away like water through his fingers. But he couldn't leave. Not now. Not when Liberty needed him most. "Frank!" Sarah noticed his distress and rushed to his side. "You're having a heart attack. We need to get you to a hospital." "No," Frank gasped, his words barely audible. "Stay. With her. Can't leave her. Alone." On the surgical table, Liberty's vital signs began stabilizing as Dr. Peterson successfully delivered the first cub, a tiny, perfect male with distinctive markings. Then the second, a female. Finally the third, another male, smaller than the others but breathing strongly. "They're alive," Dr. Peterson announced, exhaustion evident in his voice. "All 3 cubs are alive, and Liberty's holding steady." But Frank didn't hear the good news. He had collapsed beside the partition, his body finally succumbing to the stress his heart could no longer handle. Sarah knelt beside him, frantically checking for a pulse while calling for Dr. Peterson's team. "He's in cardiac arrest," one of the veterinary technicians confirmed after rushing over. "We need to get him to a hospital immediately." "No," Frank whispered with his last conscious breath. "Stay with Liberty. Promise me, take care of her babies." As the emergency medical team arrived and worked to stabilize Frank, something remarkable occurred. Liberty, still groggy from anesthesia but somehow aware that something was wrong, began struggling to stand. Despite having just undergone major surgery, despite her weakened condition, she fought to reach the partition where Frank lay unconscious. The veterinary team tried to keep her sedated, but Liberty's determination overrode the medication. She managed to drag herself to the edge of the surgical table, extending her massive paw toward the glass that separated her from Frank. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Peterson murmured, watching Liberty's struggle. "It's like she knows he's in trouble." Sarah continued filming through her tears, capturing the moment when Liberty's paw pressed against the glass directly over Frank's still form. The lioness, weakened by surgery but driven by something deeper than instinct, began to purr, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire facility. Frank's eyes fluttered open at the sound. Despite the oxygen mask and the medical equipment surrounding him, he managed to lift his hand and place it against the glass where Liberty's paw waited. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible through the mask. "Such a good girl." The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Frank for transport, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Years of hiding his heart problems, of sacrificing his own health for the sanctuary, had finally caught up with him. "Frank," Sarah knelt beside the stretcher as they prepared to load him into the ambulance. "The cubs are beautiful. Liberty's going to be okay. You did it. You saved them all." Frank's hand found Sarah's and gripped it with surprising strength. "The heart-shaped marking," he whispered. "On the smallest cub's forehead, Michael said to look for signs." Sarah glanced back at the surgical area where the 3 cubs were being examined. Sure enough, the smallest male had a distinctive marking on his forehead, a perfect heart shape in darker fur. "I see it, Frank. I see the sign." "Take care of them," Frank said, his voice growing weaker. "All of them. Liberty. The cubs. The sanctuary. Promise me." "I promise," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "But you're going to be okay." "You're going to see those cubs grow up." Frank smiled peacefully, his eyes already growing distant. "Some promises last forever," he whispered. As the ambulance pulled away from the sanctuary, Liberty managed to stand fully for the first time since surgery. Despite Dr. Peterson's protests, she walked slowly to her 3 newborn cubs, who were crying for their mother. The moment she lay down beside them, they immediately began nursing, their tiny bodies pressed against her warm fur. Blackwood arrived just as the ambulance disappeared down the gravel road. He found Sarah standing in the medical facility, still holding her camera, watching Liberty tend to her babies. "How is he?" Blackwood asked. "Dying," Sarah said simply. "He's dying, and he knows it. But he stayed conscious long enough to see Liberty and the cubs safe. That's all he wanted." Blackwood looked at the lioness and her newborns, understanding finally why Frank had sacrificed everything for this place. It wasn't about the animals, it was about love, pure and unconditional, the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. "What did Frank want you to do?" Blackwood asked. "Take care of them all," Sarah replied. "The sanctuary, Liberty, the cubs. He made me promise." Blackwood nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do. Whatever it takes." As dawn broke over the Montana landscape, Liberty settled into the rhythm of motherhood while her protector fought for his life 30 miles away in a hospital bed. The smallest cub, the one with the heart-shaped marking, seemed to sense something the others didn't. He stayed closest to his mother's heart, as if listening for something only he could hear. Neither Sarah nor Blackwood knew that Frank would never see another sunrise. Neither knew that Liberty's vigil was about to begin. But in that moment, as new life breathed its first breaths in the sanctuary Frank had built with love and sacrifice, the promise of continuation felt stronger than the threat of ending. Some bonds, it seemed, were indeed stronger than time itself. Frank Sullivan died at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning just as the sun crested the mountains surrounding Billings General Hospital. He never regained consciousness after arriving at the emergency room, his heart too damaged by years of neglect and a lifetime of carrying burdens too heavy for one man's shoulders. Sarah received the call while sitting beside Liberty's enclosure, watching the new mother nurse her 3 cubs. The smallest one, the male with the heart-shaped marking, had been struggling to feed, and Sarah had been monitoring him closely through the night. "Miss Mitchell?" The voice on the phone was gentle but clinical. "This is Dr. Harrison at Billings General. I'm afraid Mr. Sullivan passed away this morning. His heart couldn't recover from the damage." Sarah felt the phone slip from her hands. She stared at Liberty, who was looking directly at her with those intelligent amber eyes, as if the lioness somehow understood what the call meant. "He's gone," Sarah whispered to Liberty. "Frank's gone." Liberty's response was immediate and heartbreaking. The lioness stood up abruptly, causing her cubs to cry out in distress as they lost contact with their mother. She began pacing the enclosure, her head turning repeatedly toward the medical facility where she'd last seen Frank. Then Liberty did something that chilled Sarah to the bone. She threw back her head and roared, not the territorial roar Sarah had heard hundreds of times, but something entirely different. This was a sound of anguish, of loss, so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the sanctuary. The other 5 lions heard it and understood. One by one they joined their voices to hers, creating a chorus of grief that echoed across the Montana landscape. Neighbors 5 miles away would later report hearing the lions lament, a sound they described as the saddest thing I've ever heard. Sarah called Blackwood with shaking hands. "He's gone, Richard." "Frank's gone." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute before Blackwood's voice came through, cracked and broken. I should have made him see a doctor years ago. Should have forced him to take care of himself. He wouldn't have listened, Sarah said through her tears. You know that. Frank did exactly what he wanted to do. He died protecting the things he loved. What happens now? To the sanctuary? To Liberty? To the cubs? Sarah looked at the 3 tiny lives that Frank had died protecting. The smallest one, the one with the heart marking, had stopped trying to nurse and was crying pitifully for his mother, who was still pacing and calling out for Frank. We honor his promise, Sarah said firmly. We take care of them all. The next 24 hours were a blur of phone calls, legal paperwork, and heartbreak. Frank's will was simple. Everything went to the sanctuary's non-profit trust, with Sarah named as primary caretaker and Blackwood as financial guardian. But the practical details of running a wildlife sanctuary without its founder quickly became overwhelming. The cubs needed round-the-clock care, and Liberty was barely eating. The lioness spent most of her time at the fence line closest to where Frank's trailer sat, calling out periodically as if expecting him to appear. She would nurse her cubs when they cried, but her heart wasn't in motherhood. Her heart was broken. Dr. Peterson stayed to monitor the situation, concerned about Liberty's mental state affecting her ability to care for her newborns. I've seen this in domestic animals who lose their primary human bond, he explained to Sarah. Sometimes they just give up. She's not giving up, Sarah said firmly. Liberty's grieving. There's a difference. On the second day after Frank's death, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She set up a cot in the facility adjacent to Liberty's enclosure and moved in permanently. If Liberty needed constant companionship to heal, then that's what she would get. You think I'm crazy, Sarah said to Blackwood when he found her eating breakfast beside Liberty's fence. I think you're doing exactly what Frank would do, Blackwood replied. I also think you need help. What kind of help? Blackwood pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. The story of Frank's death and Liberty's grief had somehow reached the national media. The headline read, Vietnam veteran dies, saving lion cubs. Lioness mourns her protector. It's gone viral, Blackwood explained. The video footage you took of the birth, the story about Frank's sacrifice, people are responding. We've received over $50,000 in donations since yesterday. Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time since Frank's death. That's enough to... That's just the beginning, Blackwood interrupted. I've been fielding calls from documentary filmmakers, news networks, animal welfare organizations. Everyone wants to help tell Frank's story. But even as the outside world rallied to support the sanctuary, Liberty's condition continued to worry everyone who saw her. She was eating barely enough to maintain her milk supply, and her cubs were losing weight. The smallest one, whom Sarah had started calling Heart because of his forehead marking, was particularly fragile. On the third night, Sarah woke to the sound of Liberty's distressed calling. When she looked into the enclosure, she saw that Heart had stopped breathing. The tiny cub lay motionless beside his mother, who was nuzzling him frantically, trying to stimulate a response. Sarah acted without thinking. She grabbed the emergency medical kit and climbed into the enclosure, something Frank had specifically trained her never to do with a distressed mother and newborns. But Liberty, instead of attacking, stepped back and allowed Sarah to reach her dying cub. Working by flashlight, Sarah performed CPR on the tiny lion, pressing gently on his chest and breathing into his small nostrils. For 5 terrifying minutes there was no response. Then, suddenly, Heart gasped and began breathing again. Liberty watched the entire resuscitation with an intensity that was almost human. When Heart finally began breathing steadily, she gently took him from Sarah's hands and began grooming him with her rough tongue. I know, girl, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. I know you can't lose anyone else. None of us can." That night, as Sarah watched Liberty tend to her cubs with renewed purpose, she made a decision that Frank would have understood. She was going to turn Frank's story into something bigger than a local news item. She was going to make sure the world understood what love looked like. Not the easy kind, but the kind that costs everything and asks for nothing in return. The next morning, Sarah called Dr. Peterson with a proposal. "I want to document everything," she said. "Liberty's recovery, the cub's development, the sanctuary's future. I want to create a memorial to Frank that will ensure this place survives forever." "What did you have in mind?" "A documentary, a book. Whatever it takes to make people understand that Frank Sullivan was a hero and that Liberty is more than just an animal. She's family." Dr. Peterson was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, you're talking about turning the sanctuary into a public spectacle. I'm talking about turning Frank's sacrifice into something that matters. He died so those cubs could live. The least I can do is make sure people remember why." That afternoon, as Sarah was setting up her camera equipment to begin serious documentation of Liberty's recovery, something remarkable happened. Liberty, who had been listless and withdrawn since Frank's death, suddenly became alert and focused. She stood up, walked to the fence where Frank used to stand every morning, and began to call out. But this wasn't the anguished roaring of the past 3 days. This was different, purposeful, almost conversational. It was as if Liberty was talking to someone Sarah couldn't see. The conversation continued for almost 10 minutes. Liberty would call out, pause as if listening to a response, then call again. Her body language was relaxed, her tail swishing in the way it used to when Frank was speaking to her. Finally, Liberty returned to her cubs and began nursing them with more energy than she'd shown since giving birth. Hart, the smallest cub, fed aggressively for the first time, his tiny paws kneading against his mother's belly. Sarah lowered her camera, deeply moved by what she'd witnessed. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but she knew with absolute certainty that Liberty had just said goodbye to Frank Sullivan. And somehow, impossibly, he had said goodbye to her too. The healing could finally begin. Frank's funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but the revelations that emerged in the days leading up to it would shake everyone who thought they knew the full story of his life. Sarah was going through Frank's personal effects in his trailer, preparing for the service, when she found a locked metal box hidden beneath his bed. Inside were documents that would rewrite everything she believed about Frank Sullivan and his relationship to the sanctuary. The first document was Frank's original adoption papers, not for Liberty but for a child. Sarah Mitchell, born Sarah Sullivan, had been adopted by Frank when she was 13 years old, after her parents died in a car accident. The memory came flooding back like a dam breaking, Frank finding her in the Montana foster system, bringing her to the sanctuary, teaching her to love animals the way he loved Michael. "How could I have forgotten?" Sarah whispered to herself, holding the adoption papers with trembling hands. The trauma of losing her biological parents, followed by years of Frank encouraging her to pursue her own dreams rather than remain dependent on him, had somehow buried the memories deep in her psyche. But there was more. At the bottom of the box was a letter addressed to her, written in Frank's careful handwriting and dated just 2 weeks before his death. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're going through my things like I taught you to do, methodically and thoroughly. By now you've found the adoption papers and remembered who you really are. I know the memories got buried when you went away to veterinary school. Sometimes the mind protects us from pain by hiding our deepest connections. You are my daughter in every way that matters. Not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the promise I made to your parents that I would give you a life worth living. You've kept me going all these years, even when you didn't know it. The sanctuary is yours now." Not because I'm leaving it to you, but because it always was yours. You built this place with me, one rescued animal at a time. You just forgot that part too. Take care of Liberty. Take care of the cubs. Take care of yourself. Love always, Dad. Sarah sat in Frank's tiny trailer, surrounded by the sparse belongings of a man who had given everything away, and cried for the father she had forgotten and found again in the same moment. When Blackwood arrived an hour later to discuss funeral arrangements, he found Sarah still clutching the letter, her face streaked with tears. "Richard," she said without looking up, "did you know about the adoption?" Blackwood's silence was answer enough. He sat down heavily in Frank's worn armchair, looking older than his 58 years. "Frank made me promise never to tell you unless something happened to him," Blackwood said quietly. "He said you needed to find your own way in the world, not feel obligated to stay because of old debts." "Old debts?" Sarah's voice cracked. "He was my father. I abandoned my father for veterinary school while he slowly killed himself taking care of lions." "You didn't abandon him," Blackwood said firmly. "You did exactly what he wanted you to do. Frank was prouder of your success than anything else in his life except Michael. He used to show everyone pictures of you graduating, pictures of you working with animals. He'd say, 'That's my daughter, the one who's going to save the world.'" The funeral service was held at the sanctuary itself, just as Frank had specified in his will. But what should have been a simple memorial service turned into something unprecedented when over 300 people arrived. Veterans from Michael's unit, neighbors from across Montana, animal rights activists who had heard Liberty's story, and media crews from around the world. The service began with military honors. Michael's former commanding officer, Colonel James Martinez, had flown in from Washington to present Sarah with the flag that had draped Frank's casket. "Frank Sullivan embodied the best of what we try to teach our soldiers," Colonel Martinez said in his eulogy. "Service above self, loyalty beyond reason, and love that transcends loss. His son Michael would be proud." Dr. Peterson spoke about Frank's devotion to animal welfare, sharing stories of midnight emergency calls and Frank's refusal to let any creature suffer if he could prevent it. Local veterinarians told of Frank quietly paying for their services to help other pet owners who couldn't afford care. But it was Sarah's eulogy that broke everyone's hearts and changed everything. "I forgot he was my father," she began, her voice steady despite the tears. "For 5 years I forgot that this man adopted me, raised me, loved me unconditionally. I thought I was just a volunteer who happened to care about his lions." The crowd murmured in surprise. This revelation had not been part of the media coverage. "Frank never reminded me, never made me feel guilty for forgetting. He just kept loving me, kept supporting my dreams, kept believing I would find my way back to him when I was ready." Sarah's voice broke. "I wish I had remembered sooner. I wish I had told him I loved him one more time." She pulled out Frank's letter and read it aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. "Frank taught me that love isn't about being perfect," Sarah continued. "It's about being present. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. It's about keeping promises, even when no one is watching." As Sarah spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. Liberty, who had been restless in her enclosure since the crowds arrived, began to move toward the fence closest to the gathering. Her 3 cubs followed, stumbling on unsteady legs. "Frank made me promise to take care of Liberty and her cubs," Sarah said, noticing the lioness approaching. "But I think the truth is, they're going to take care of me, because that's what family does." Liberty reached the fence just as Sarah finished speaking. The lioness sat down and, for the first time since Frank's death, began to purr, a low, rumbling sound that carried across the suddenly silent crowd. Then Liberty did something that would be captured by dozens of cameras and seen by millions of people around the world. She stood up, walked to the gate of her enclosure, and used her massive paw to push against the latch mechanism that Frank had taught her to operate years earlier, something only Frank and Sarah had known she could do. The gate swung open. The crowd gasped and instinctively stepped backward, but Liberty didn't charge or threaten anyone. Instead, she walked calmly to Frank's casket, which was positioned on a raised platform in the center of the gathering. Security personnel reached for their weapons, but Sarah called out firmly, "Don't. She's not dangerous. She's saying goodbye." Liberty approached the casket and laid down beside it, just as she had laid beside Frank's hospital bed, just as she had comforted him through countless lonely nights at the sanctuary. Her cubs, confused but trusting their mother, toddled over and curled up against her warm fur. The sight of the grieving lioness and her babies beside Frank's casket created one of the most powerful images in the history of human-animal relationships. The crowd remained perfectly still, witnesses to something that transcended the normal boundaries between species. Liberty stayed beside the casket for the entire remainder of the service. When the military honor guard fired their 21-gun salute, she didn't flinch. When the bagpiper played Amazing Grace, she seemed to listen intently. And when it came time to move Frank's casket to its final resting place beneath the old cottonwood tree he had chosen, Liberty stood and followed the procession like a member of the family. The burial site had been prepared in a meadow overlooking the sanctuary, where Frank would have a clear view of all the enclosures. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Liberty took up a position that she would maintain for the next 40 days and nights, lying beside the grave, keeping watch over the man who had saved her life and given meaning to her existence. The media coverage of Liberty's vigil would eventually reach over 100 million people worldwide. The sanctuary received donations from every continent, enough money to ensure its survival for generations. But more importantly, Frank's story became a testament to the power of unconditional love. As the crowd began to disperse that evening, Sarah remained at the gravesite with Liberty and the cubs. Blackwood approached quietly, not wanting to disturb the sacred moment. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah looked at Liberty, who was gently grooming Heart, the smallest cub with the distinctive heart-shaped marking. "Now we keep Frank's promise," she said. "We take care of each other. We show the world that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form." Liberty looked up at Sarah with those intelligent amber eyes and rumbled softly, as if agreeing. In that moment, Sarah felt the presence of two fathers, the one who had given her life and the one who had given her purpose. The vigil was just beginning, but Sarah knew with absolute certainty that Frank's legacy would live on in every life they saved, every bond they honored, and every act of love that refused to surrender to loss. Some promises, she realized, really do last forever. 6 months after Frank Sullivan's funeral, the Circle of Life Wildlife Sanctuary had transformed into something neither Frank nor Sarah could have imagined. What began as one man's quiet mission to save abandoned lions had become a beacon of hope that drew visitors from around the world, all coming to witness the extraordinary bond between Liberty and her human family. Liberty's vigil had captured global attention in ways that defied explanation. The lioness maintained her daily routine of visiting Frank's grave every morning at dawn, spending exactly 30 minutes lying beside the headstone before returning to care for her cubs. Wildlife cameras installed by National Geographic documented this ritual, and the footage became some of the most watched animal behavior content in Internet history. The cubs, Heart, Hope, and Frank Jr., had grown into healthy, playful young lions under their mother's devoted care. Heart, the smallest with his distinctive heart-shaped marking, had developed an unusual bond with Sarah, often approaching the fence when she arrived each morning as if he understood she was family. Sarah had embraced her role as Frank's daughter and the sanctuary's director with a passion that surprised even herself. The forgotten memories of her childhood with Frank had gradually returned, bringing with them a deep understanding of why she had always felt drawn to this place. It wasn't coincidence that had brought her back as a volunteer. It was love, calling her home. "You've created something remarkable here," Dr. Jane Goodall said during her visit to the sanctuary in late October. The renowned primatologist had come to observe Liberty's behavior and stayed for 3 days, fascinated by the complex emotional intelligence the lioness displayed. "I've studied animal behavior for 60 years, and I've never seen anything quite like Liberty's grief response and recovery. She's teaching us something profound about the nature of love itself." The sanctuary now employed 12 full-time staff members and hosted educational programs that brought thousands of school children to learn about wildlife conservation. Blackwood had established a veterinary training center on the property where students from around the world came to study large animal medicine and conservation techniques. But perhaps the most significant change was the Veterans Therapy program that Sarah had developed with Colonel Martinez. Twice a week, combat veterans dealing with PTSD came to work with the lions, finding healing in the presence of creatures who had also survived trauma and learned to trust again. "There's something about these lions," explained James Rodriguez, a Marine veteran who had been struggling with severe depression since returning from Afghanistan. "They've been hurt, abandoned, but they still choose to trust. If they can do it, maybe I can too." The program had a 93% success rate in reducing PTSD symptoms, and requests for participation came from veterans across the country. Liberty seemed to understand her role in these sessions, approaching the fence whenever veterans visited, her calm presence offering a kind of healing that traditional therapy couldn't provide. On the first anniversary of Frank's death, Sarah organized a memorial celebration that drew over 1,000 visitors. The event featured speakers from around the world discussing animal consciousness, human-animal bonds, and the power of unconditional love. As the sun set on that anniversary day, Sarah found herself alone at Frank's grave with Liberty and her cubs. The lioness had spent longer than usual at the headstone that morning, and Sarah could see something different in her amber eyes, a kind of peaceful acceptance that hadn't been there before. "You're ready to let go, aren't you, girl?" Sarah said softly, kneeling beside the fence. "Frank wouldn't want you to mourn forever." Liberty approached the fence and, for the first time since Frank's death, allowed Sarah to touch her massive paw through the chain link. The gesture was simple but profound, a passing of trust from one guardian to another. That night, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. She moved her bed into the facility adjacent to Liberty's enclosure, not as a temporary measure during a crisis, but permanently. If she was going to be Frank's successor, she needed to fully embrace the level of commitment he had shown. The decision proved prescient 3 weeks later when Liberty went into labor again. This time, the birth was natural and uncomplicated, producing 2 healthy cubs that Liberty immediately began caring for with the confidence of an experienced mother. Sarah assisted with the delivery, and the trust between them was so complete that Liberty allowed her to handle the newborns within minutes of their birth. One of the new cubs, a female, had markings remarkably similar to Liberty's own pattern. Sarah named her Grace, understanding that this new generation represented hope for the future, not just for the lions, but for the continuing mission of the sanctuary. The success of Liberty's second litter attracted the attention of conservation biologists who were studying the reintroduction of captive-bred lions to the wild. While Liberty and her original cubs would always remain at the sanctuary, her new offspring might eventually contribute to conservation efforts in Africa. Frank's dream was always bigger than this sanctuary, Sarah explained to a documentary crew filming the one-year anniversary special. He wanted to prove that love and dedication could save species, one animal at a time. Liberty's cubs might help restore lion populations that have been decimated by habitat loss and hunting. As the sanctuary's second year began, Sarah faced a new challenge that tested everything Frank had taught her about tough decisions. A major zoo offered to purchase Hart for their breeding program, citing his unique genetics and calm temperament as valuable contributions to lion conservation. The offer was substantial, enough money to fund the sanctuary's operations for 5 years. But watching Hart play with his younger siblings, seeing how Liberty's eyes followed him wherever he went, Sarah understood that some things truly weren't for sale. Frank always said that family isn't about bloodlines, Sarah explained to Blackwood when he presented the zoo's formal offer. It's about commitment, about showing up, about keeping promises. Hart belongs here with his mother, with us. Blackwood smiled, remembering similar conversations with Frank over the years. I think you're starting to sound like your father. Good, Sarah replied. That means I'm finally remembering who I'm supposed to be. The sanctuary's influence continued to expand beyond its Montana borders. Sarah began consulting with wildlife facilities around the world, sharing Frank's philosophy of patient, loving care. She testified before Congress about the importance of wildlife conservation funding and spoke at universities about the science of human-animal bonds. But every morning, regardless of her schedule or the demands of running an internationally recognized facility, Sarah maintained Frank's ritual. At 0600 hours, she would walk to Liberty's enclosure and spend 30 minutes talking to the lioness about the day ahead, about the challenges and victories, about the dreams they were building together. Liberty, now 13 years old and considered elderly for a lion, had developed arthritis that slowed her movements, but not her spirit. She remained the undisputed matriarch of the sanctuary's lion population, teaching her cubs and grandcubs the lessons Frank had taught her about trust, patience, and unconditional love. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had gone home and the Montana sky blazed with stars, Sarah would sit beside Frank's grave and update him on their progress. She told him about Hart's growing leadership among the younger lions, about Hope's gentle nature with visiting children, about Frank Jr.'s protective instincts that reminded everyone of his namesake. "We kept your promise, Dad," she would say, using the word that had taken her too long to remember. Liberty's family is thriving. The sanctuary is secure. And maybe most importantly, we're proving every day that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to grow. The transformation was complete on a cold February morning when Sarah discovered something that made her believe in miracles again. Liberty, now mother to 5 cubs ranging in age from 2 years to 6 months, had begun teaching them a behavior that no one had trained her to do. Every morning after Sarah's visit, Liberty would lead her entire family to Frank's grave. The lions would sit in a semicircle around the headstone while Liberty approached alone, touching the marker with her nose before returning to her family. It was a ritual of remembrance, passed from mother to children, ensuring that Frank's legacy would live on in generations of lions who had never met him but understood somehow that they owed their lives to his love. As Sarah watched this spontaneous memorial service through tears of gratitude, she finally understood the full meaning of Frank's final letter. Love doesn't end with death. It evolves, grows, and creates new connections that span species and generations. Frank had saved Liberty. Liberty had saved Sarah, and together they were saving countless others. The circle of life, Sarah realized, wasn't just a beautiful phrase from a children's movie. It was the fundamental truth that Frank had lived and died for. that every act of love creates ripples that spread far beyond what we can see, touching lives we'll never know, creating hope we'll never fully comprehend. In saving one lioness from a cruel circus, Frank Sullivan had launched a movement that would protect wildlife around the world. In choosing love over fear, commitment over convenience, he had created a legacy that would outlive them all. Some promises, Sarah now knew with absolute certainty, really do last forever. Frank Sullivan's story reminds us that the most powerful bonds in life aren't always the ones we're born with. They're the ones we choose to nurture every single day. Like Frank, many of us have faced the devastating loss of those we love most, wondering if our lives still have meaning when the people who gave our world purpose are gone. But Liberty's unwavering devotion to Frank, even after his death, teaches us something profound. Love doesn't end when life does. It transforms, continues, and creates new connections we never expected. Sarah's journey from forgotten daughter to devoted caretaker shows us that it's never too late to remember who we really are, to reclaim the relationships that matter most, and to honor the sacrifices others made for our happiness. Frank spent his final years giving everything to protect creatures who couldn't protect themselves, finding purpose in service and meaning in unconditional love. His legacy lives on not in monuments or wealth, but in every life he touched, every heart he changed, every bond he helped create. What relationships in your own life deserve the kind of devotion Frank showed Liberty? Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal or unexpected friendship helped heal a broken heart? Share your story below, because sometimes the connections that save us come from the most surprising places.